Kame-wise, Ramesses II was the most well-known pharaoh, as he intended it to be. He is frequently referred to as the Jupiter of the pharaonic system, an appropriate metaphor considering that the giant planet is just a ball of gas, even though it looks bright from a distance. Hot air is the hieroglyphic equivalent of Ramesses II, whose throne name eventually gave rise to the Ozymandias of Strabo and Shelley. It's a fitting tribute, given that these days every donkey boy and tourist tout in the Nile Valley knows his name. But Ramesses has attained his dream afterlife. His mother goes to Paris for an autopsy and exhibition, and millions of people read a French author's series of best-selling airport lounge novels about his life. Many saw Yul Brynner as the Pharaoh of the Exodus because he captured his essence in the movie The Ten Commandments. Though the historical background has been hotly contested, it is indisputable that Ramesses represents the archetypal haughty king who disobeys divine commands. Only the last-minute arrival of reinforcements from the Lebanese coast saved him from his battle against the Hittites at Kadesh, Syria, which was almost the result of a basic failure in military intelligence. Ramesses' story, a prominent feature on many of his monuments, elevates this almost disastrous event to the greatest of all victories. The battle was described as follows by Scottish divine James Bakey, 1866-1931, who had a porky streak and wrote an excellent guidebook to Egypt's monuments without feeling the need to visit the country. The Egyptian court, we imagine, must have been slightly weary of the whole business. Despite the fact that the unfortunate soldiers of Amun and Re had paid the piper, Ramesses was the one who set the tone and was not tired of showing off his prowess. This pharaoh thinks less of Memphis and Thebes, the traditional capitals, and is planning to build a new capital in the delta called Pyramesse, which is essentially Ramessopolis. Not even Akhenaten had the audacity to give him the name of his city. The man claims to be the father of over 100 sons, demonstrating the breadth of his thinking about his family. He may no longer count his daughters, even though he only lists 60. Because engraved relief creates powerful shadows, it was the preferred method of exterior wall decoration for earlier pharaohs. They used bas-relief inside the temples to avoid these contrasts and create a sensual effect in the semi-darkness. Unfortunately, because the figures' backgrounds must be removed, bas-relief takes a long time. From this point on, Ramesses determines to double the average pace of temple construction by ensuring that the majority of the work is completed in a quick, low-cost incised relief. Similar tactics were tried by Akhenaten, but his motivation was to build a new city for his god, instead of continuing with the old ones. But Ramesses II has no such justification. Taking everything into account, he is in line with the nasty and cheap. Several arguments in favor of Ramesses are made in the revisionist histories of his reign. After the Battle of Kadesh, an international peace treaty with the Hittites was signed. A copy of this treaty hangs on the wall of the UN General Assembly building. This is undoubtedly a success. Ramesses is just the logical continuation of the idea that modesty was not regarded as a pharaonic virtue, as we have seen in the case of Hatshepsut. Being the best is the essence, so if the kings of Egypt are great by definition, then there's nothing wrong with trying to be the best. An additional mitigating factor pertains to Ramesses' family origin. The model for Ozymandias was the grandson of the revered Ramesses I, better known as Horemheb's partner in the corresponding grey suit. Had he studied recent history, Ramesses II would have seen the chaos of the Amarna period, a time that is quickly vanishing from history. But beyond this was the Thutmoside family, a dynasty linked to wealth, grace, the expansion of empire and achievement. The king's father, Seti I, stood tall over him. His reign is considered the height of Egyptian art because of its balance and restraint. Ramesses was responsible for carrying out these difficult deeds, such as eluding Seti and outsmarting the Thutmosides by yelling louder than they were, drowning them out. Ramesses II's temperament was ideal for this kind of leadership, and the gods granted him a 67-year reign to hone it. Despite this difficulty, turning from this conceited man to his family is a relief. There were many minor wives throughout the reign, but only two main queens. Nefertari is well known because of her beautifully adorned tomb in Luxor's Valley of the Queens. Today, the restored tomb is a well-known landmark in Egypt. Good art flourished under Ramesses's reign without the weight of the king's ego, especially in the early years when artists from his father's court were still working. Nefertari's monuments are concentrated in what may have been her sphere of influence, the southern part of the nation. The king's fondness for her was influenced by her charm, which is frequently mentioned in her inscriptions, and her position as the mother of multiple princes and princesses, among them the eldest son and heir Amenhotep, who is said to have Amun on his right hand. Named the loveliest of them all, Nefertari appears to have passed away before the 31st year of her reign. Less well known is Isinofre, also known as Isis the Beautiful, who is the second principal wife. Although this queen's tomb is located in Luxor, her influence is greater in the north. She could boast of having given birth to the king's second son, cleverly named Ramesses, and his favorite daughter, Bintanath Canaanite, for daughter of the Syrian goddess, Anath. We now turn to Linefre, who was also the mother of the fourth heir, Prince Kamwise. She was, in essence, a contemporary of her rival. Although it is unknown if Kamwise inherited his mother's traits, it is safe to conclude that he did not. Even though Kamwise's name means manifest in Thebes, it's crucial to remember that names can be misleading. The majority of his monuments and inscriptions are found in Memphis, indicating that he thought of this city as his home. This would support the hypothesis that his mother had her headquarters in the nation's north. The site's age and wealth of monuments drew him in back then. Despite the paucity of popular works devoted to Kamwise, Egyptologists find him fascinating due to his fascination with the past and consider him one of their own. Although the truth is nuanced, the title is accurate. In our opinion, he is the first Egyptologist. And even though the term Egyptologist did not exist in ancient Egypt, this learned prince would have understood its meaning. It was not just Kamwise who was alone. There is a greater interest in what can be called personal piety and a sense of history during the Ramesside period. If the Amarna period's upheavals and the subsequent analyses of Egyptian culture hadn't spawned this tendency, they would have encouraged it. A fossilized sea urchin near Heliopolis had a hieroglyphic inscription that a Ramesside scribe found so amazing that he decided to dedicate it to the gods. It became fashionable to visit ancient monuments. In the first chapter of this book, we meet the scribe Nashuyu, who visited the Djoser and Teti monuments at Saqqara and wrote a graffito about his visit. Additional records from this era are known. This was still more of a recreational activity, though. Kamwise turns the once-weekly afternoon excursion into a full-time job. One of Ramesses' principal sons, Kamwise, occasionally makes an appearance in his never-ending battle reliefs. Even though he had witnessed military action at a young age, he quickly realized this was not his calling. The prince had a natural affinity for the priesthood of Memphis's primary deity, Ptah. The House of the Spirit, K of Ptah, or Hakuptah, was one of the names for this god's sanctuary. It later spread to Ugarit on the Syrian coast and became one of the nation's names. Later, Greek traders in Aegyptos took up this name, giving rise to the contemporary equivalent. Ptah had a unique aspect of his theology and patronized technology and craftsmanship. Kamwise might have discovered during his apprenticeship how Ptah assembled the universe by using his tongue to name the elements and his heart, or mind, to imagine and realize them. This idea is comparable to the Jewish understanding of the Word of God, which influenced Christian theology regarding the Logos. It is unquestionably an amazing abstract achievement. These are the hallmarks of a society that established divine kingship, extracted a single principle from the multitude of regional deities, and assembled the only rational calendar ever devised, freed from the contradiction between the duration of the solar year and the lunar month's mathematical formula. Our calendar is nothing compared to other calendars. According to Kamwise, he joined the god Ptah's service when he was still a young man. His ascent through the hierarchy was undoubtedly undisturbed by his bond with the living deity that governed the domain. Kamwise appears to have been the right man in the right place, although many cultures have used the priesthood as a platform for sons of the aristocracy and spare princes. When Kamwise was appointed high priest of Ptah in Memphis, his religious career reached its pinnacle. Kamwise would have been about 30 years old in the year 25 if this appointment had happened. Although the position of first prophet of Amun at Karnak held greater sway during the New Kingdom, he remained the head of the religious hierarchy, according to conventional wisdom. As the keeper of much royal protocol, the high priest of Memphis assisted in crowning the pharaoh among his duties. Alexander himself is said to have attended a coronation ceremony in Memphis when he first arrived in Egypt. During the royal burial, the high priest performed a filial duty in addition to his duties towards the living king. He was frequently shown with a lock of hair hanging from his forehead, signifying youth, and wearing leopard skin, traditionally associated with a position of prestige. The icon frequently precedes everyday reality in Egyptian art, even when the high priest of Ptah was well into his 70s. In this role, the high priest was called the Setum, a word of important antiquity and ambiguous meaning, which Kamwise frequently uses now. Several years before becoming high priest, he was bestowed with this title, designating him as the presumed heir to the position. The second best temple library in Egypt was available to the Memphis high priest, and he might have been entitled to use the best one, located a short drive northeast of Memphis at Heliopolis. Khayyam was naturally drawn to antiquarian research, and some of his inscriptions indicate that he was never happier than when he read the records of bygone eras. His works are jam-packed with technical terms and poetic wordplay. He can become comfortable playing the part of the scholarly priest or chair professor. His role is significant in the modern world, but his social integration is even more crucial. Ramesses II must have had a mixed relationship with his sons. He was a proud father, as any father would be, and his monuments extolled his sons. But they also fostered competition. Many of the princes predeceased him, partially explained by the great age he survived. The king may have ignored some of the sons because he thought they posed a threat. Rivals could have turned deadly once the king divided and exercised power. The son was wise enough to see that he could use his antiquarian interests to reflect glory on his overburdened parents, and Kamwise's scholarly pursuits did not threaten anyone, though there might have been times when he had to keep his knowledge to himself, as it might have been a more lucrative career move to refute or correct Ramesses II. Several king lists from this ruler's reign have been preserved, either on the walls of temples and even private tombs or written on papyrus. A fragmentary one is in Turin and would have been very valuable if intact. Ramesses II discovered one in the temple he constructed at Abydos for the god Osiris. The deceased monarchs of history are assimilated in this composition, not just to Osiris as is customary, but also to the persona of Ramesses. He represents them and the pinnacle of the entire historical sequence. The one who enshrined the past kings is honored when we remember and pay tribute to them. Historically, archaeology has been a promiscuous discipline, lending its support to political ideologies, ethnic stereotypes, or religious convictions based on the demands of its clients. Kamwise was willing to play his part in the past, serving the present. Kamwise must have decided to stroll the plateaus of Giza and Saqqara, examining the Old Kingdom pyramids that had overlooked Memphis for over a millennium. Some of these pyramids had deteriorated during Kamwise's reign because of time and the pharaohs' habit of reusing the monuments of their predecessors whenever possible. The pharaohs initiated a restoration program that could fulfill multiple functions, including paying tribute to the great monarchs of the past, enhancing historical knowledge, and spiritually modernizing the monuments to become a part of the magnificence of Rome. Shepseskaf, the late 4th dynasty king, constructed an unusual oblong tomb for himself called a mastaba in place of a pyramid. It was already 2 centuries old when Kamewise examined it, but it still needed care. On its outer wall, Shepseskaf's names were written opposite Ramesses, and the following was positioned beneath this. Since his name was nowhere to be found on the face of his pyramid, His Majesty gave the high priest of Ptah and Setem, Kamewise, instructions to engrave the cartouche of King Shepseskaf. Setem Kamewise took great pleasure in repairing the king's monuments, reinforcing what had crumbled. Kamewise demonstrates piety by consistently using the Egyptian terms pious and piety. Think about these religious compositions, as one of his refrains advises. But piety also served as a flattering tool. Restoring monuments from obscurity was a useful way to illustrate the king's religious duty, to drive out chaos and darkness from the land. This text appears on several monuments in Saqqara and the surrounding areas, and more may have been lost. However, a more personal hint of Kamewise's affection for the past can be found in a piece of text missing from the statue of a man named Kawab. Kamewise likely stumbled upon this statue close to the tomb of this man, who was the son of the man who constructed the Great Pyramid and passed away over a millennium ago. Kamewise was effectively excavating at Giza. He says the following about how this discovery affected him. Found hidden in the bottom of a shaft in his father Khufu's well, this statue of the king's son Kawab delighted the high priest and Prince Kamewise. Because he loved the nobles who lived in antiquity before him and the excellence of everything they made, 1,000,000 times over, he took action to place it in the favor of the gods, among the glorious spirits of the chapel of the necropolis. Nothing sums up Egyptian identity more accurately than this. The fact that the chapel where this statue was rededicated was mentioned implies that it served as a kind of museum for artifacts pulled out of the sands, and our sources have other examples of royal collections of antiquities, so this theory is not outlandish. The allusion to the grandeur of the past might not be purely romantic. Kamewise might have thought certain things about the world he lived in were disappointing and not always noble. Kamewise read about theology and began to consider the meaning of the cult of sacred animals, one of the most distinctive features of Egyptian religion. We have already discussed the Apis bull, which is very important to Kamewise. Based in Memphis, the Apis occupied the same position in the animal kingdom as the pharaoh did in the human world, and it had its own temple complete with stalls. Its titles ranged from king of every sacred animal to incarnation of Ptah, the first of which derives from a root meaning to repeat. It's difficult to translate, but if we use a term borrowed from Hinduism, we can say that the Apis was an avatar, standing in for the god of Memphis, whose priest was Kamewise. The Apis eventually grew old and died, just like a pharaoh, at which point he went to Osiris. The locations of the earlier Apis bulls' graves are unknown, but we began burying them in the Saqqara Desert, west of the Step Pyramid, during the reign of Amenphis III. This invention is linked to Thutmosis, the older brother of Akhenaten, and the son of another monarch. This prince was strongly interested in animal cults. Had he lived, he would have become Thutmosis IV. Kamewise felt a bond with this unusual prince and may have even inspired him. The Cairo Museum holds a sarcophagus he commissioned for his pet cat, which depicts an animal in the shape of a mummy and bears the somewhat hybrid name Osiris the she-cat. Had Thutmosis survived, the Amarna period would not have occurred, and cults such as the Apis could have refuted Akhenaten's heresy. Kamewise got to work improving the Apis. In the year 30, Ramesses II buried the final Apis in seclusion at Saqqara. The next stage was excavating a whole catacomb beneath the location of the solitary Apis burials. The bulls were housed here in a series of vaults, each holding a granite sarcophagus that could weigh up to 80 tons. Camewise's masons dug out a connecting corridor that extended over yards through the rock to connect the vaults. When this gallery was expanded at the start of the 26th dynasty, it served its intended purpose. The complex's later galleries, known to modern tourists as the Serapeum, were still used during Cleopatra's reign. A temple devoted to Osiris Apis, the amalgam of the living Apis and the deceased Apices who had once resided on Earth, stood above the catacomb. Camewize indulges in a little bombast in his dedication inscription, which was typical of these kinds of inscriptions. 0 divine fathers, duty priests, seam priests, and high priests of the house of Ptah, who are in front of the god, who will enter the temple I have built for the living Apis, and who will see my accomplishments etched on the walls of stone. When you contrast this with the ignorant and subpar labor of the ancestors, it will undoubtedly seem like a pious thing to you. Keep my name in mind when making decisions. Compared to Camewise's other inscriptions, this jab at the ancestors seems like a tasteless statement, but in this instance the superlatives are appropriate, and the gods were accustomed to rhetoric of this kind. He was, after all, the son of the master of hyperbole and a high priest. Such an inscription probably required the approval of Camewise's father. Camewise, one of the first Egyptologists, discovered that learning about Egyptology can lead to financial success. Ptah's priesthood was intellectually and financially fulfilling, and as a son of Ramesses, he would have also received some compensation. He could study his ancient texts with freedom because he experienced a significant emotional state that could have operated independently. A papyrus in Leiden holds a portion of one of his ship's logbooks. A few days in the winter of the king's year 52, roughly 1228 BC, are covered in the text. At the beginning of the voyage, the ship docks at Ramesses, the new capital in the delta. This log keeps track of arrivals and departures, lists all deliveries made to the crew, and occasionally sends messengers to Memphis bearing letters for the Setim, as Camewise is known. Other people seem to be passengers in addition to the crew. The ship then sets out, and on the 3rd day of the 3rd month of winter, a strong south wind filled the sky, a sign of impending sandstorms typical of Egypt from February through April. The boat docked at Heliopolis in the evening of the following day. This was not a trip for enjoyment or to transfer passengers from one location to another. Produce was brought on board and then sold again down the river in this trading operation. Over a few years, a boat like this could have easily paid for itself. Furthermore, there is proof that Camewise may engage in more trading than this. In this somewhat fantastical story, the titular hero of the voyage of Wenamun engages in a protracted discussion with Zechariah, the king of Byblos on the Phoenician coast. Eventually, the cunning Levantine chastises him. Look now, I have spared you the same fate as the messengers of Camewise. The messengers were in this land for 17 years before they met an untimely death. Subsequently, he instructed his cupbearer, take him to see the tomb where they lie. However, I instructed him not to force me to see it. Like Wenamun, the messengers of this story would have traveled to Lebanon to purchase cedar wood and other types of wood for a temple or the crown. Wenamun has certain aspects that are evocative of Homer's Odyssey, but there's no reason to deny that such an accident could have happened. Even though the text was written 2 centuries after Camewise, it might contain elements of fiction and fact. Thus far, we have constructed an image of a restrained scholar of considerable means, which would have been accurate for many of Camewise's professional life. But as the king's reign dragged on, the demands on his 4th son increased. His older brothers each died separately, bringing Camewise closer to the throne. This alone would have required more formalities and additional duties. Nevertheless, Ramesses's addiction to publicity was a contributing factor. Following their 30-year reign, pharaohs were entitled to a jubilee celebration. They were then allowed to celebrate additional jubilees but at discrete intervals. Celebrating these jamborees in the years 30, 33, 36, 39, 40, 42, 45, 48, 52, 54, 57, 60, 63, and 66, Ramesses developed a serious addiction to jubilees. The Kamewise was in charge of many of these events. He spent months touring the nation to ensure the appropriate god statues were available for the celebrations, spoke with local officials, and planned the ceremonies in general. This improved his standing in court, but he must have secretly wished for the process to end and yearned for the peace and quiet of his temple libraries. Kamewise ended rather than his father. He was exhausted by the never-ending Durbar procession, and by the regnal year 60, Prince Merneptah, an older man, the king's 13th son, was expected to take the throne instead of Kamewise. So the gods of Kamewise willed. One of the most amazing finds in recent years has been made close to the Valley of the King's Entrance. This is the grave with the KV5 number. It was discovered by an explorer named James Burton in 1825 when he took a quick look at this tomb. It was thought to be unfinished, possibly a fictitious prototype for Ramesses II's tomb, which was constructed deeper into the valley. But after returning to this tomb in the 1990s and cleaning it out, an American team concluded that it was nothing less than the collective grave of Ramesses' numerous sons. It looks like a multi-story parking lot built on 2 stories inside the rock. 150 chambers would be almost the same as the number of sons and daughters Ramesses boasted about. Although it will take years to complete this amazing monument, it is easy to draw parallels between the Serapeum, an animal royalty complex, and this catacomb for human royalty. Though Kamewise may have contributed to both projects, the High Priest of Memphis was meant to be separate from KV5, regardless of the original plan. It is still unclear where Kamewise was buried. The French archaeologist Auguste Mariette started excavating the Serapeum in the early 1850s, working quickly but producing a steady stream of important discoveries. At the center of Kamewise's main gallery, Mariette claimed to have found jewelry emblazoned with the cartouches of Ramesses II and the mummified remains of a man wearing a golden funerary mask. But the mummy is no longer there, casting doubt on its human identity. The fact that Mariette used explosives at this point in her career also leaves a powerful, if not entirely accurate, historical record. Maybe somewhere in the Serapeum or close by, Kamewise, like Imhotep, is still waiting for diggers beneath the sands of Saqqara. A distinct twist to the tale was introduced in the 1990s, when a Japanese team began excavating a building atop a natural rise overlooking the Serapeum region. From the excavations in the sacred animal necropolis mentioned in the chapter, the author, a junior excavation team member in the late 1960s, could clearly see this rise and recalls wondering what was hidden on top of this prominent hill. This was a military zone at the time, and archaeologists were not allowed anywhere near it. The Japanese found an odd temple-like building with reliefs and writings dedicated to Kamewise. Kamewise's study of arcane literature makes its design distinct in Egyptian architecture. The shrine honors the deceased prince's cult, but his tomb is nowhere to be found. The ghost of Kamewise could have looked east toward Memphis, his earthly home, or west toward the boundless desert from the temple atop the ridge. He could have also looked south toward Dashur and all the pyramids from Giza to the south. Of all the characters in this volume, Kamewise has the most colorful afterlife. Setem, his administrative title, changed to Setne, requiring him to give up his name. A few years after his death, he appears under this name in several works written in demotic hieroglyphic shorthand. The Setne of these stories is sometimes recognized as the learned priest who read the inscriptions on the monuments, but in the years since then, he has grown somewhat of a ribald character. The Cairo Museum currently houses the first story, Ptolemaic. In his trademark manner, Setna deciphers hieroglyphs on temple walls after learning that a book containing the universe's secrets is hidden in an old tomb. When he eventually finds the tomb and enters, a hospitable family of ghosts enchants him with tales from their lives. The narrative tells how he returned down the tomb shaft, the light from the enchanted scroll illuminating his way, after repaying the ghosts for their hospitality by taking the book. In an attempt to get even, the ghosts humiliate Setna several times in an effort to make him come to his senses. The ghost's creation of Tabubu, an exceptionally beautiful phantom woman, marks the story's culmination. One day, Setna stumbles upon this woman in the Ptah temple and tries to set up a meeting to discuss an assignment. "What kind of woman do you think I am?" she asks in return. "This is my address." Setna continues with his assignment, but at the last minute, the phantom woman vanishes into thin air after making a string of unconscionable financial demands, leaving Setna lying on the ground looking embarrassed. This is when Pharaoh enters. He was ashamed and without clothes, so he tried to get up but was unable. He becomes convinced that fighting the ghosts is pointless due to this inappropriate incident. He makes amends with them and uses their book to bury them once more. Setna learned something from this encounter, and in the second story, which dates to the early Roman era and is kept in the British Museum, he picks up another lesson. In this tale, Setna and his wife are without a son until, as a result of a dream, they give birth to a miraculous child. The youngster is a portentous narcissist, Osiri, or son of Osiris. Father and son witness two funerals one day, one for a wealthy man and the other for a poor man who has no one to mourn him. When Setna wishes to be buried like the rich man in splendor after he passes away, Osiri responds that if his father knew anything, he would wish to be buried like the poor man. Setna is led by Osiri to the necropolis, where they discover a tomb entrance that opens into the underworld. The damned suffer from severe torture in one area of eternity, such as having to plait ropes that the eternal donkeys eat to ribbon right away. The rich man whose funeral they saw and whose behavior throughout life they found deficient is the one in whom the judges of eternity have fixed the pivot of the door to the underworld. At last, they find themselves in front of Osiris, who is given instructions by a man dressed in radiant robes. He's the impoverished man leading a happy life. Though many have pointed out the parallels with the story of Lazarus and the Dives, the idea that paradise requires becoming a bureaucrat is uniquely Egyptian. After all of this, it becomes evident that Osiri, a famous magician from the past, planned his rebirth to save Egypt from the disaster caused by a Nubian sorcerer. After finishing his work, he disappears in flames, resembling a phoenix, and that evening, Setna's wife becomes pregnant with a real son. The Setna stories, which became extremely popular in later Egypt, retain some of the traits of the real Kamwise. It's okay that Kamwise shamed Setna for his extracurricular activities. The enrichment of Egyptian civilization by both cultures is a cause for celebration. Perthes, the temple scribe. Egypt joined the Persian Empire in 525 BC. Not every pharaoh had Egyptian ancestry, and the nation had experienced foreign rule before this period. Hatshepsut detested the Hyksos, a group ruled by Near Eastern invaders who took over the Delta during the Second Intermediate Period. After the fall of the New Kingdom, a lack of political cohesion made it possible for military officers with Libyan ancestry to take control of multiple cities, mostly in the north of the nation. But these were the people who ruled Egypt. But these people ruled Egypt from within, adopting hieroglyphic writing, paying homage to customary gods, and creating dynasties to prove they were better Egyptians than the native population. Dynasty 27 refers in textbook parlance to the reign of Cambyses, Darius, and Xerxes over Egypt. However, this nomenclature is seldom employed. While Darius and Xerxes were Zoroastrians and not devotees of Horus and Thoth, the pharaohs of Persia ruled from Susa and Persepolis in Iran, respecting the Egyptian religion. A satrap, based in the natural capital of Memphis, was in charge of the nation but had no financial independence. A different chancellor, answering to the king, was in charge of economic matters. Satraps would often make their way back to Persia with tales of their prosperous provinces well managed. Even if they had been in a position to do so, the Persians, like most ancient powers, accepted cultural diversity and did not see the need to suppress Egyptian customs. Egypt lost much of its political independence but was still able to preserve its culture and religion. It was a part of an international state for the first time. The nation that the Persians annexed had struggled to recover its economic standing under the 26th dynasty, 664–525 BC. Although this dynasty, like the majority in Egypt's history, was based in Memphis, the term Sate for the era came from Sais in the Delta. The era is characterized by a cultural resurgence of literary and artistic themes and devices popular in the Old and Middle Kingdoms. Conventional Egyptology books frequently depict this as a lifeless reiteration of uninspired concepts, but this impression may be influenced by our lack of familiarity with Egyptian customs. Because we are its heirs and comprehend its values, we respect the Italian Renaissance. An outsider seeking to comprehend the Renaissance might find little new compared to ancient Greece and Rome. Site art is gradually becoming more acknowledged for its resurgence, even though the era that gave rise is still underappreciated. Politically speaking, Egypt's late period was distinct from most of its previous history in that a hostile power was always present on its northeastern border. This enemy was Assyria in the 7th century BC, Babylonia in the second half of the 6th century, and Persia in the last half. Although the first two powers could conquer Egypt multiple times, they could not establish lasting control over the nation. However, the threat persisted, and the Sates had to import military hardware to neutralize it. The Greek world supplied much of the knowledge and labor required for this, and the Site pharaohs quickly saw that they had to strike a balance between accommodating the old army aristocracy and expanding their military institutions. The last caste was extremely envious of its customs and standing, and a rebellion among them would be disastrous. This careful balance ultimately failed, which resulted in the nation's eventual loss of independence. Still, it is remarkable that the dynasty survived in a world that had changed dramatically from the New Kingdom. People tend to overemphasize one aspect of the late period, while undervaluing the political acumen of the Sate pharaohs. Immigrants attracted to Site Egypt for military or commercial purposes found it hard to leave, though Pharaoh's status as one of the richest employers in the world probably also had some influence. Egypt was home to sizable populations of Near Eastern Greeks, Anatolians, Phoenicians, and Aramaic-speaking traders, as well as Jews, Libyans, Nubians, and other Africans from further south along the Nile. They could anticipate protection from the authorities if they complied with the nation's financial and criminal laws. Racial discrimination was minimal or non-existent, but there was a lot of pressure on these communities to blend in with Egyptian society. The definition of an Egyptian who lived in Egypt and worshipped the gods of Egypt, one's or family's origins, had less bearing than this. But most textbooks ignore Site Egypt's polyglot culture, thinking it was a peculiarity of the late period. The New Kingdom has a similar situation, which applies to the Middle Kingdom, albeit on a smaller scale. It might apply to Egypt during the majority of its lengthy history. Egyptian culture frequently ignores the reality that many Egyptians were foreign-born grandparents or relatives during the ancient and medieval periods. This situation was passed down to the Persians. The Achaemenid dynasty preserved much of it while improving many aspects of Egyptian life. As the official language of the government, they instituted Aramaic, which is widely used in the Near East. A barter and redistribution-based economy welcomed the introduction of coinage. cotton would only have become an important crop in Egypt because of the Persian invention. Codifying the legal system as it existed in the final year of the nation's independence was one of Darius the Great's main achievements after seizing power in 522 BC. The same tyrant was also in charge of excavating the Suez Canal. The concept of connecting the Mediterranean and the Red Sea dates back to the 19th century BC. In any case, during the reign of Seti I, Prince Kamwesi's grandfather, a canal crossed the Suez Isthmus. The Achaemenid plan, however, followed the dimensions of a global empire. 12 million cubic meters of earth are thought to have been dug up for this project. This estimate does not account for the freshwater wells built. The canal was wide enough for two triremes to pass one another, and along the southern part of the empire between the Gulf of Suez and the Bitter Lakes were stelae with inscriptions in Egyptian hieroglyphs and Iranian cuneiform that listed the satrapies of the empire. The waterway was officially opened when Darius visited Egypt in 497-6 BC. Egypt sent a flotilla of 24 ships down the canal, headed for Persia, the great king tells us. I ordered digging this canal, which connects the sea in Persia to the Nile stream, which passes through Egypt. My wish came true. Ships left Egypt and sailed to Persia via this canal. The benefits of Achaemenid rule over Egypt are clear, and this represents their zenith. Every country's citizens benefit from a thriving global economy. Although official sources may have needed to be adjusted for the benefit of the ruling class and those who relied on them, they would like us to have this impression of the nation. Though it may not be entirely false, the official image is untrue. The optimistic picture presented by official sources and the reality of daily life in the rest of society will always differ. That being said, the situation described in the text known to Egyptologists as Papyrus Rylands Num presents us with what seems to be a completely different country. However, this papyrus is from the time of Darius the Great, who crossed the Red Sea with his flotilla. This text has no superstate pharaohs, international lawyers, or state openings. This manuscript is unique in that it contains meandering narratives of mismanagement, insolvency, minor corruption, and family strife in a small town in Middle Egypt in the 6th century BC. Moreover, the Petition o Peties, or Rylands 9, is ancient Egypt's most enlightening secular document. It would be covered in detail in most textbooks if it weren't written in Demotic. But outside of the small circle of scholars who enjoy working with it, it remains largely unknown because it is written in this unprepossessing script. The Site period initially used two different administrative systems. It was used in the north of the country, where Demotic originated, while Abnormal Hieratic, a different script, was used in the south. Demotics had become the only means of everyday and business communication in the Egyptian language before the arrival of the Persians. The hardest part of this script phase is early Demotic, represented by the Petition of Peties, successfully decoded by the scholar Francis Llewellyn Griffith. Griffith's 3-volume catalogue of Demotic papyri in Manchester's John Rylands Library was published in 1909. It would take a lot of work to top this catalogue, one of the great works of Egyptology, nearly a century later. The Petition of Peties begins in July 513 BC with the unexpected arrival of a stranger who looks like a character out of a Western movie in the town. The town in question, Tujoy, was situated in Middle Egypt on the east bank of the Nile. El Hibe is the site's current name, but it needs to be visited by tourists. When it served as a frontier post between rival territories during the Third Intermediate Period, the location was strategically significant. But by the time of Peties, it had essentially reduced to the size of a two-donkey town. The stranger was Ahmose, a priest at the Tujoy temple, and the god of Tujoy was Amun, who had once served as the patron of a powerful empire. Ahmose is a priest by appointment, but that doesn't stop him from receiving a stipend from the temple. Since priestly stipends were shared with an annual dividend, they could be bought and sold in ancient Egypt. Ahmose is curious why his dividend was last paid out so long ago. The temple president clarified that obtaining a loan would be the only way out of their financial situation. When Ahmose inquires about the beginnings of this circumstance, he finds out that the only person who can give the full history is Petiis, son of Esemtu, the temple scribe. The narrator of our document is the Petiis in question. Petiis, the gift Ophelsis, would have been about 70 years old when Ahmose arrived in town. His sense of grievance and understanding of his family history are strong. His memory of historical details needs occasional brushing up due to his advanced age and reliance on family records to piece together his narrative. He may have required access to a king list or an exact chronology. He frequently lacks organization, rambles across generations, and occasionally revisits the same topics. But with enough work, one can piece together the narrative and understand the importance of his message. Ahmose takes Patience into custody, loads him onto his ship, and sails him to Memphis to meet the Persian chancellor. When they reach the provincial capital, they make Petiis stand in the sun until he explains Tujoy's financial ruin, adding with the fake friendliness of a bully, "I have refrained from beating you only because you are an old man and would have died." The older man finally calls for a paper roll and writes his statement, tired from the sun. By doing this, Petiis convinces Ahmose of his innocence and is freed to return to his hometown. Petiis is again taken into custody by the Amun priests, who also imprison the majority of his family. The president of the temple might be fired and imprisoned similarly. The next action appears to be typical of a place like this backwater. All of Tujoy drank beer on Mekir 13, IO June 512, the festival of Shu. The guards keeping watch over us drank beer as well and went to sleep. Then the disgraced president of the temple, Jebastefunk, fled. When the warders awoke, they fled without finding him, and the warders watching us also took off. The warders may not have been paid either, according to suspects, and most of the time, absconding was a regular part of peasant life in Egypt. After that, the temple authorities took matters into their own hands, beating Petiis and his family and confining them close to the temple gate in a dilapidated tower. Subsequently, the tower collapsed onto them. The Persian authorities sent Petiis back home, where the doctors treated him for 3 months, realizing that doing this would only provoke their wrath. Why has this little town been destroyed? The farmer Hekanakta chapter claims the solution is similar, but his issues have only recently begun. The temple's management, the hub of the community's economy, has been tainted by a generation-long feud at Tujoy. Petiis includes the family archives in his extensive request to piece together the history of this conflict. The known grey area between payments made to an individual because of their position and payments made to an individual is the point of contention. On both sides of this long-running dispute, the Petiis family and the priesthood of the local god Amun capitalized on the hazy boundaries that could arise from a system like this. The priests claimed that the money came from their positions and the people they appointed to hold them, but the Petiis family saved payments to their members from the temple in their small town as individual payments. Although the priests had the legal right, they let their resentment spread to benefits that actually belonged to Petiis' family, and the issue swiftly moved beyond formal legalities. Petiis comes across as knowing the truth, which was nuanced by his extremely circumspect first response to any question regarding the situation. He had spent a lifetime learning how to respond to officials with the economy. The early years of Psammeticus's reign, which established both the late period and the 26th dynasty, are when history started. The outgoing master of shipping, a significant figure in the resurgent administration, announced his retirement in the 4th year of this king, 660 BC, and he appointed another Petiis, the son of Turu and the great-great-grandfather of the current narrator, as his successor. This Petiis was a genius who had brought Upper Egypt's wealth back to half its previous level. After Pharaoh approves of this appointment, Peties I, as we may call him, focuses on Tujoy's affairs because he has some family ties to them. This temple, which had prospered during the location's strategic importance, had fallen on hard times. Locations such as Tujoy were neither economically self-sustaining nor subject to royal patronage. A recurring pattern is evident here. They were, therefore, susceptible to shifting circumstances. The local school scribe witnessed a contract that gave Peties I a portion of the priestly revenues after he worked another economic miracle for Amun of Tujoy. The narrator claims this priestly revenue was inherited and eventually passed down to Peties's son and grandson. There is a romantic pause in which the daughter of Peties I makes love to a young man called Haruoj. The couple is rewarded by their patron, the retired master of shipping, with an amazing home fit for a priest. Only priests and those who enter the temple are allowed inside. Such fleeting moments of introspection are typical of Peti's work. They add color to the document, but can make things a lot more complicated. The older man enjoys painting large canvases. At Tujoy, things go as planned until the 31st year of the same Psammeticus reign, 633 BC. While Peties II is away in Thebes, the priests of Tujoy use the opportunity to misappropriate a portion of his stipend. Shall he keep taking 1/5 of the divine endowment as long as the sun god lives? The ironic allusion to this outcast of a southerner critiques Peties's absence from Luxor, but the stereotype of the South as a joke still exists in contemporary Egypt. The priests of Tujoy are unexpectedly dismissed by the Chancellor's court in Memphis. If one lived in Memphis, the south of Egypt started quite far north, and this petition is full of tidbits of information. But the situation quickly becomes more serious than amusing when the priests target Peties I's 2 young grandsons in particular. "Come with your staves in the evening, lie down on this emmer wheat and hide your staves till morning," they charged some young, evil-minded creatures. When the 2 boys came to the temple to measure their 5th part, the young men took out their staves from the corn, surrounded them, and started beating them. The boys ran away from them into the sacred area, but the men pursued them and, strangely enough, apprehended them at the shrine of Amun's entrance. They threw them into a storeroom inside the stone podium after beating them to death. It's turned from a stipend dispute into a blood feud. Things simmer until nearly 2 generations later, during the reign of Psammeticus II. In the 4th year of this king's reign, 592 BC, preparations started for a campaign, or more likely a flag-waving exercise, in Palestine or along the Phoenician coast. Representatives from every Egyptian temple were expected to participate in the state procession with garlands. Who else but Peties II, our narrator's grandfather, could be more deserving of such an honor? The priests uphold this, and as Peties travels the world on behalf of his god, his colleagues begin to redistribute the temple by their own opinions. Returning to the royal palace in Memphis, the resentful Peties II seeks justice only to be met with the words, "Disaster. Pharaoh is sick. Pharaoh cannot come out." The king's reign was running out of years. Peties eventually loses his Mephi case and goes back to Tujoy. The parties come to a sort of agreement, and further legal action is advised with the following telling words: "There is nothing to gain from visiting the House of Judgment. In this instance, your opponent is wealthier than you. If you had 100 pieces of silver, you would still lose to your opponent." As a result, they convinced Peties not to visit the House of Judgment. Justice comes at a high cost in many societies. After that, our narrator launches into a long diatribe regarding the happenings during one of the following reigns: Ramesses, 570–526 BC. When he withheld a portion of the temple's endowment, a farmland superintendent defrauded the priests of a portion of their entitlement. The priests were looking for someone to blame for their declining income, so this disagreement persisted, and even stoked an old rivalry with the Peties family. After demolishing the home of our narrator's father, Esemtu, they focused on the memorial stelae and statues that the original benefactor, Pharaohs I, had placed on the temple platform. One statue showed the great man sitting with a statue of Amun on his lap, while the other showed the man standing in front of an Osiris chapel. They threw the statues into the river. The other stelae were granite, but the first was easily vandalized. Upon observing this, the stonemason provided the traditional explanation. "I cannot sully this. This is a granite worker. You must vandalize it. My tools are not gripping. They do not touch this monument," and Pharaohs III's petition contains a transcript. He cites additional temple inscriptions, several placed in Amun of Tujoy's mouth, concerning the need for justice and the punishment meted out to evildoers. Pharaohs may have transcribed these inscriptions accurately, as their language is far more formal than the petition itself. His usual weakness with numbers, though, has come to light because some of the dates he gives need to add up with the ones we have that come from monuments. The records that Pharaohs cited, however, were lost centuries ago and are only preserved in this extraordinary papyrus. It's time to go back to the main story. Once his injuries have healed, Pharaohs III schedules a cheap wooden boat ride to Memphis. After 7 months of petitioning the chancellor, he receives 5 summonses for the misbehaving priests. The deviant priests show up and are sentenced to 50 lashes apiece after getting the 5th summons. They can bribe the advocate who ought to be arguing Pharaohs' case in the interim, enabling them to depart without any additional inquiry. One evening, Pharaohs successfully approaches the chancellor once more as he leaves his office and starts talking about his family background. It makes sense that the chancellor reacted as he did because this account would have been even less logical than the papyrus. "You are telling me a lot of things. Why don't you go to a house, get a pen and paper, and record all the events that transpired for your ancestors from when this share was given to them? Explain what happened when your father took the share to the present. These are useful stalling strategies." Sadly, Pharaohs cannot rely on his dishonest ally in court, as he successfully has the case dismissed with ambiguous promises to write to every party concerned. Pharaohs is asked, "Are you Pharaohs? And are you going to teach joy?" by some of his fellow villagers as he returns to Tujoy. "The fire has already destroyed your home, so save your time." Pharaohs has no choice but to return to the chancellor, who dispatches an agent to look into the matter more thoroughly and retrieve the priests involved in this crime. The agent eventually reappears with a lone suspect, who promptly retracts his claims. As customary, the suspect receives 50 lashes from the chancellor's court, but the case is not closed. However, the priesthood moves Pharaohs to relate the full history of family feuds and his misfortunes, so the affair cannot end here. Papyrus Ryland's Nime is the outcome, meant to serve as a last-ditch appeal to the authorities, possibly even the satrap himself. The document was discovered with the others in Manchester amidst the ruins at El Haibay, and it was clearly never taken from its original location. Perhaps a copy was sent to Memphis in the interest of justice, or Pharaohs' advancing years forced him to join his fathers. Either way, it's unclear what will happen. All we have is Pharaohs' version of events. The priests of Amun would have had their own, no doubt equally detailed. But it is obvious that we are dealing with a society that was anything but orderly and that adhered to democratic ideals. This text may embarrass those who revere ancient Egypt, and one may be tempted to assign the blame to the Persian occupation. Ultimately, the Persians would not have been particularly intrigued by the goings-on in a small Middle Egyptian town, or the meanderings of an older man harboring resentment. However, this passing could be more effective. The same deceit and obfuscation were used by Egypt's own pharaohs to meet Pharaohs' ancestors in the courts of Psammetichus and Amasis. Despite their incompleteness and partisanship, the administrative texts from previous eras present a comparable image. This society operated through bribery at times, and arbitrary power struggles resulted in total impasses at other times. This was sometimes the result of issues that escalated over generations until the authorities untangled these Gordian knots. A reliance on elusive ideals of harmony and shared humanity keeps such a society bearable. It becomes unbearably difficult when one refuses to take a back seat and give up on their interest group, even when that group is the cause of injustice and increasing violence. The somber words on the walls of Egyptian tombs have a darker side, which is reflected in the world of Rylands 9. The tomb owner tells everyone about his life, providing clothing for the naked, food for the hungry, and transporting beggars to the other bank, which didn't have a ferryman. These people swear that they have never chosen between two brothers in a way that would rob a son of his inheritance. These were not empty ideals. 50 years after Peties wrote his petition, Herodotus visited Egypt and noted the high civility he observed there. Mayat, the goddess of harmony and justice, and the daughter of the creator god, was adored by Horemheb. Peties's petition, however, shows that Ma'at has the authority to undo her actions. It is easy to think that Peties arrived in Memphis and found justice since his cause was just. It is reasonable to suppose that he did. And we can also hope that his judge remembered the sage Ptahhotpi's words from many centuries ago. When you receive a petition, pay close attention to what the petitioner says. Wait until he has expressed his entire heart and the reason for his visit before you reject him. A suppliant would rather have his words recognized than have the issue he has come to address resolved. More than any other petitioner, he is happy about this. But people might wonder about his intentions if he turned away a petitioner. Peties might have been fortunate enough to meet an official who had heeded this practical guidance, but it's also conceivable that he didn't.